The wind howled across the open plains like a restless spirit, rattling the dry bones of the prairie grass and bending the cottonwoods that stood like sentinels. Near the Carson ranch, the sky was black and wide, split now and then by jagged veins of lightning that lit the world in flashes of white-blue fire. Emma Carson hunched low in her saddle, her oilskin cloak snapping in the storm's fury. The lantern hanging from her saddle horn swung wildly, its weak light cutting only a small path through the sheets of rain. Somewhere out there in the darkness, her calves had broken through the fence during the storm, and every instinct in her told her she had to find them before the coyotes did. She was a woman who knew how to endure. 5 years a widow, 5 winters of loneliness, 5 springs spent coaxing stubborn earth to yield enough to survive. The frontier didn't forgive weakness, and Emma had learned long ago that tears didn't grow crops or mend fences. But tonight, beneath the thunder's roar and the pounding rain, even her iron will trembled. The storm wasn't natural, it had a rage to it, as though the heavens themselves were punishing the land. Her horse, Jasper, snorted nervously as lightning forked across the sky again, casting brief, eerie daylight over the ranch yard. That's when she saw it, a dark figure, crumpled against the side of her barn, unmoving. For an instant, she thought it was one of the hired men seeking shelter, but the shape was wrong, too still, too heavy with silence. Emma's hand went instinctively to the rifle holstered beside her saddle. Out here, unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. She dismounted, boots sinking into mud, and crept closer, every nerve tight. The rain was colder now, biting against her face. She held up the lantern, the flames sputtering in the wind, and gasped. It was a man, Cowboy, by the look of him, slumped upright against the barn wall, as if exhaustion had frozen him there. His hat hung low, dripping rain, concealing most of his face. His coat was torn and filthy, streaked with dust and blood. But what made Emma's breath catch wasn't the man himself, it was what he held. 2 small bundles, wrapped in tattered blankets, nestled against his chest, babies, twins, their faces pale but peaceful, pressed close to him as though even in his half-conscious state, he had shielded them from the storm. The man's arms were wrapped around them protectively. His body curved forward as if even in sleep or death he refused to let go. Emma knelt, her fingers trembling as she touched his shoulder. The fabric was soaked through, cold as stone. "Sir," she called, her voice breaking in the wind. No answer. She shook him gently, then harder. Still nothing. Lightning flashed again, and she caught a clearer glimpse of his face beneath the brim of his hat, gaunt, unshaven, streaked with grime. He looked young, maybe 30, but worn by hardship. Her heart pounded in her throat. The twins stirred faintly, one giving a weak cry that pierced the storm. Relief washed through her, they were alive. She pulled the nearest bundle closer to her chest, feeling the faint, trembling breath. "Oh, you poor things," she whispered. Turning back to the man, she pressed her fingers against his neck, praying she wouldn't feel the cold finality of death. For a terrible second, there was nothing. Then a pulse, faint, fragile. "But there, thank God," she murmured. She looked around the ranch yard. No tracks she could see in the mud except her own and his. No horse tied nearby, no wagon overturned. Whoever he was, he'd come on foot, through miles of storm. Her mind raced with questions. What kind of man would do that with infants in his arms? And what had driven him here, to her door, on a night when the plains themselves seemed cursed? The thunder rolled again, closer this time, and Emma knew she couldn't leave them out there another second. She pushed her shoulder beneath the man's arm, half dragging, half lifting his limp body toward the barn door. He was heavier than he looked, muscle beneath the exhaustion. Every step was a struggle through mud and rain, but she didn't stop. The twins whimpered softly, their cries muffled by the storm. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the scent of hay and horses. She laid the man down gently on a pile of straw and set the babies beside him, wrapping them in an old wool blanket from the tack room. Their faces were flushed now, their breaths quick but steady. Emma brushed a wet lock of hair from her face and stared at the stranger, still trying to make sense of what she'd found. He looked like he'd been riding through hell. His boots were cracked, spurs dulled with rust. The scars on his knuckles told stories of fights long past, and the gun at his hip, though waterlogged, was well kept. The kind of weapon a man didn't carry unless he'd had reason to use it. Emma crouched beside him, her heart still hammering. "Who are you?" she whispered into the quiet. The only answer was the soft whinny of horses and the faint, rhythmic breathing of the twins. The lantern light flickered over his face, and something about him stirred a distant ache in her. Something familiar in the lines of sorrow round his mouth, the exhaustion that only comes from loss. She wrapped her arms around herself and shivered, though it wasn't from the cold. For years she'd managed her loneliness by pretending she didn't need anyone. But seeing this stranger, so utterly broken yet still holding those children with desperate protectiveness, cracked something open inside her. It was the same look her husband had worn the day he died, the look of a man fighting to protect what little good he had left in a cruel world. Emma exhaled shakily and stood, glancing toward the barn doors. The storm was still raging outside, thunder echoing across the open land like the voice of something ancient and angry. She bolted the doors shut, then turned back to the man. "Well," she murmured softly, kneeling beside him once more. "Whoever you are, you're safe here tonight." She placed her hand gently on the smaller twin's chest, feeling the faint rise and fall beneath the blanket. The baby stirred, sighing in its sleep, and a small smile, unfamiliar, uninvited, tugged at Emma's lips. Lightning flashed again through the cracks in the walls, illuminating the scene in brief, haunting beauty. The stranger slumped in exhaustion, the twins sleeping against his side, and Emma standing over them, a lone figure framed by shadow and storm. And though she couldn't explain it, not yet, something deep within her whispered that this night would change everything, because no one just appears in the middle of a storm, half dead and holding to newborns, without carrying a story that could either break your heart or save it. The storm broke before dawn, leaving behind a land washed clean but wounded. Pale light spilled across Carson Ridge, revealing puddles in the rutted road, sagging fences, and the soft hiss of water dripping from the barn roof. The smell of wet earth filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of horses and smoke from the morning fire Emma had kindled. It was a new day, but it carried the heavy stillness that often followed nights when the world had nearly come undone. Emma stood by the kitchen window, a steaming cup of coffee trembling slightly in her hands. Beyond the glass, the prairie stretched endless and silver beneath the sunrise, each blade of grass shining like wet glass. She'd barely slept, her thoughts restless, circling back again and again to the man in her barn, the stranger, who had arrived like a ghost in the storm. She'd checked on him twice through the night. He hadn't woken, only stirred faintly, muttering a woman's name once softly, like a prayer. The twins had slept beside him, curled together in a pile of blankets near the straw, breathing the small, fragile breaths of children who had seen too much before their first words. Now, as daylight chased away the shadows, Emma tried to make sense of it all. She'd heard the whispers in town weeks ago, rumors about a man wandering the frontier, a former soldier or scout named Luke Maddox. They said he'd deserted after his wife's death, disappearing into the hills with no explanation. Some called him a coward, others a broken man with blood on his hands. In towns like Carson Ridge, stories grew fast and wild, and truth was often left to die in the dust. Emma had never cared much for gossip, but now, standing there with the image of that stranger burned into her mind, she couldn't shake the thought that maybe the rumors were about him. His face had the hollowed look of someone who'd lost everything, and his arms had held those children with the fierce desperation of a man trying to save the last good thing he had left. She stepped out onto the porch, the boards creaking beneath her boots. The air was cool and heavy with the smell of sagebrush. Across the ridge, the town was just waking. Smoke curled from chimneys, a rooster crowed somewhere down by the river, and the sound of a wagon wheel echoed faintly against the hills. It was a quiet place, Carson Ridge, a cattle town born of dust and stubbornness, where folks worked hard, prayed harder, and trusted almost no one. Emma had lived here her whole life. Her late husband, Samuel, had built this ranch with his own hands before fever took him one spring. Since then, the land had been her burden and her shield. She'd faced drought, sickness, and the cold judgment of men who didn't believe a woman could run a ranch alone. And though she'd survived it all, something in her had hardened along the way. Trust had become a luxury she couldn't afford. But now, fate had thrown her a test she never asked for: a wounded man and to helpless infants who didn't belong to her, yet stirred something she thought long buried. She turned her gaze toward the barn. A thin trail of smoke drifted from the chimney of the bunkhouse nearby, and the sky was painted with streaks of pink and gold. It should have been a peaceful morning, yet Emma felt the same unease she'd felt when she first saw the stranger in the lightning's glow. There was a reason he'd come here, to her land, in the middle of a storm, and deep down, she knew the quiet of Carson Ridge was about to be shattered by whatever truth he carried. The morning stretched long before Luke Maddox stirred. The barn was quiet except for the soft rustle of hay and the cooing of the twins beside him. Sunlight filtered through the cracks in the wood, painting golden stripes across his weathered face. His eyes fluttered open gray, clouded with confusion, and for a moment he looked like a man waking in a world he no longer recognized. Emma stood near the stall, arms crossed, her posture guarded but her eyes searching. She'd been waiting for this moment since dawn. "You're awake," she said softly, but there was no warmth in her tone, just the edge of a woman too used to being careful. Luke blinked, tried to sit, and grimaced as pain cut through him. "Where?" His voice was rough, dry as dust. "You're on my ranch," Emma replied. "Found you outside last night, half dead, clutching those babies. You're lucky the storm didn't finish you." He looked down at the twins, one stirring against his arm, the other still asleep. Relief passed over his face like a shadow chased by light. "They're safe," he murmured. "Thank God." Emma took a step closer, studying him. "Who are you? And whose children are they?" Luke hesitated. She could see at the flicker of caution, the instinct to hide. But then his shoulders sagged under the weight of exhaustion and grief. "They're mine," he said finally. "They're Ma. She didn't make it. Died tonight's back on the trail." His voice cracked on the word died. Emma's throat tightened. "And you were traveling where?" "Anywhere that'd take us," he said. "Used to have a place near Laramie, but it's gone now. Everything's gone." The barn seemed to shrink around them. Emma wanted to believe him. His voice carried the kind of hurt a man couldn't fake. But she'd lived long enough to know stories often came wrapped in half-truths. Before she could ask more, the crunch of boots on gravel made her turn. Sheriff Duggan stood in the doorway, his badge catching the light. A big man with a jaw carved from stone. Duggan had the kind of authority that didn't need to shout. He tipped his hat slightly. "Mornin', Miss Carson. Heard you took in a stranger." Emma's heart sank. Word traveled fast in Carson Ridge to fast. Luke tensed, his hand instinctively brushing the nearest twin closer. Duggan's eyes flicked to the babies, then to the man who guarded them like a wolf. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "Didn't expect to find you here, Maddox." Emma frowned. "You know him?" "Reckon most folks around here do," the sheriff replied grimly. "Luke Maddox, former scout, accused of desertion and theft. Took off from Fort Laramie last spring with 2 stolen horses and, by the sound of it, a pair of stolen babes." Luke's jaw clenched. "That's a lie." Duggan folded his arms. "That's so? 'Cause last I heard, your wife died months ago, not days. You expect me to believe those twins are yours?" Silence fell like a blade. Emma's pulse quickened. She looked between them, the sheriff's suspicion, Luke's raw desperation. "He said his wife died on the trail," she said quietly. Duggan's gaze softened a little as he looked at her. "Emma, I'd advise you to keep your distance. Man like him brings trouble wherever he goes. You've got a good name in this town, and a ranch worth protecting. Don't risk either for a drifter with stories that don't line up." The words stung more than she expected, not because of Duggan's warning but because she saw something in Luke's eyes that contradicted every ugly rumor. Pain, yes, but not guilt, not deceit. Still, she said nothing as the sheriff turned and left, his spurs clinking against the porch steps. When the silence returned, Luke spoke, his voice low. "You think I'd lie about my own blood?" Emma looked at the twins, tiny, fragile, innocent, and then back at the man who held them like they were the last light in a world of darkness. She didn't answer. Trust was something she'd buried years ago. But as she watched the drifter cradle his children, a quiet unease whispered through her heart because deep down, part of her already wanted to believe him, and that frightened her more than any outlaw ever could. For 3 days, The stranger remained hidden in Emma Carson's barn. The doctor from town came quietly under cover of night, stitched the wound in Luke's shoulder, and left without asking questions, a kindness Emma knew wouldn't last long. Once tongues started wagging. By the time the first whispers reached town, she had already moved Luke and the twins up to the hayloft, away from prying eyes and wandering boots. The loft became their secret world, a sanctuary of straw and shadows. When the wind howled through the cracks, Luke would hum soft lullabies, his voice rough but steady, and the twins would fall asleep nestled against him. Emma found herself drawn there more often than she admitted, bringing food, checking the babies, pretending it was only duty that made her climb that ladder each night. But when she saw the way Luke looked at his children, how exhaustion and grief melted away. Each time they laughed, something inside her began to thaw. It was dangerous, that feeling. Compassion was a crack in armor she'd spent years building. Outside, the air grew thick with talk. Men in the saloon claimed they'd seen a fugitive on her land. Women at the general store murmured about a secret guest. Emma ignored them all, though her stomach twisted tighter each time a rider passed the ranch too slowly. But not all eyes were strangers. Tom Reeves watched her with a mix of longing and resentment. He'd worked the Carson ranch since before Samuel's death, and he'd always imagined the widow would come to rely on him. He knew the land, knew her routines, knew she didn't laugh much anymore. When she started disappearing into the barn after sundown, his curiosity curdled into suspicion. One evening, as dusk settled like a shroud over the prairie, Tom leaned against the fence, chewing a stalk of dry grass. Through the half-open barn doors, he heard something: soft laughter, a woman's voice, then the low murmur of a man's reply. Tom's jaw tightened. By morning, he was at the saloon, spinning his story. "Heard the Carson widow's got herself a drifter holed up in her barn," he said, his tone heavy with mock concern. "Word is, she's protecting a wanted man. Maybe he ain't the only one sleeping under her roof." Laughter rippled through the crowd, mean and sharp, and just like that, the whispers in the wind became a storm of their own, one that would soon test every ounce of Emma's courage, and every truth Luke Maddox had left to stand on. The days that followed were thick with tension. Emma could feel it in the air, the weight of eyes on her back whenever she rode into town, the way conversations hushed when she entered the mercantile. The whispers had grown teeth. Even the sheriff's friendly nod had cooled into polite suspicion. She kept her head high, but inside, fear clawed at her chest. Every night she'd climb up to the loft, bring a lantern, food, and a smile she barely felt. Luke always tried to reassure her, though he carried his own worry behind tired eyes. Then one morning, hope came riding through the gate in the hands of the mail rider. A single envelope, sealed with the official stamp of Fort Laramie. Emma's heart leapt when she read the return mark: Captain J. Rollins. She'd written the fort a week earlier, desperate for the truth. Hands trembling, she tore the seal open right there on the porch. Her eyes skimmed the words once, then again, hardly daring to breathe. Luke Maddox was no deserter. The letter told of how he had stayed behind during an Apache raid, buying time for a wagon train to escape. He'd been reported missing, presumed dead until months later. A survivor had finally told the story of the man who'd saved them. Emma pressed the paper to her chest, tears welling. "They were wrong about you," she whispered, smiling for the first time in weeks. She turned to head toward the barn, to show Luke his freedom in ink and seal, but Tom Reeves was already there, standing by the corral, wiping his hands on a rag and watching her too closely. "What's that you've got, Miss Carson?" he asked, his voice smooth but his eyes sharp. "Nothing that concerns you," she said quickly. Folding the letter, Tom's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Now, Emma, that don't sound like the truth." He stepped closer, boots scraping against the dry earth. Before she could react, his hand shot out, snatching the letter from her grasp. "Hey," she cried, lunging for it, but Tom was faster. He unfolded it, scanned the words, and his jaw tightened. "Well, ain't that a story?" he muttered. "Would have cleared your friend's name, if only it hadn't gotten lost." He folded the paper neatly, slipped it into his vest pocket, and tipped his hat with mock politeness. "Sheriff Duggan'll want to see this. Folks deserve to know what kind of man you've been hiding." "Tom, please," Emma pleaded, stepping after him. "You don't understand. but he was already mounting his horse, his expression dark and cold. "I understand plenty," he said, "and I won't watch you throw away your good name for a man who's brought nothing but shame." As he rode off toward town, dust trailing behind him like smoke, Emma's heart pounded with dread. She turned toward the barn, clutching the emptiness where the letter had been, her voice breaking. "They'll come for him now," she whispered, "and I've no proof to stop them." Night fell heavy over Carson Ridge, the kind of still darkness that makes the world hold its breath. A thin crescent moon hung low over the horizon, silvering the tops of the prairie grass. Emma lay awake, unable to shake the dread gnawing at her chest. Ever since Tom had taken that letter, she'd known something was coming. The air itself felt wrong to quiet. To waiting out in the barn, Luke rocked the twins to sleep, their soft whimpers fading beneath the low hum of his voice. He didn't tell Emma, but he'd seen the riders watching from the ridge that afternoon, men from town, likely fed on Tom's poisonous words. He knew what was coming to Dot just before midnight. The first flicker of orange appeared on the far edge of the barn. It was small at first, like a candle flame trembling against the wind, but within moments it leapt higher, greedier, racing up the dry boards with a crackle that turned into a roar. Smoke billowed thick and black. Fire. Emma's scream split the night. She burst from the house barefoot, her hair unbound, racing across the yard as the flames devoured the barn's side. Luke, the babies. Inside, Luke jolted awake to the sound of splintering wood. Heat rolled through the air like the breath of a furnace. He snatched the twins from their cradle of blankets and pressed them close, coughing as smoke clawed at his lungs. Flames licked the rafters above, raining sparks down like molten rain. There was no time to think, only move. He staggered toward the door, but a beam collapsed in front of him, blocking the exit in a burst of sparks. The fire crackled louder, hungry and merciless. The twins began to cry, their voices thin and terrified. Luke's eyes burned as he turned toward the only other escape, the small side window above the stall. Outside, Emma shouted his name again and again, her voice breaking with panic. Townsfolk were gathering now, drawn by the glow in the night. Sheriff Duggan arrived on horseback, shouting orders, but the fire was already too strong to fight. "Luke!" Emma screamed again, tears streaking her soot-covered cheeks. "Get out!" And then through the smoke she saw him, a figure stumbling through the doorway, coat aflame, arms wrapped tight around his small bundles. The sight stopped every heart in that yard. He pushed through the wall of heat, each step agony, the fire biting at his sleeves and hair. Emma ran to him, her feet sinking into the wet ash, her breath ragged. He fell to his knees just as she reached him, the twins still clutched to his chest. Without a word, she threw herself over him, smothering the flames with her bare hands, beating out the fire that threatened to consume him. The smell of smoke and burnt fabric filled the air. "Luke!" she gasped, shaking him. "Luke, please!" He coughed, eyes blinking open, soot streaking his face. "They're safe," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "They're safe." The sheriff dismounted and rushed forward, taking one of the infants as Emma clung to the other. Around them, the crowd stood, silent faces lit by firelight, eyes wide with disbelief. The man they'd called a deserter, a thief, a liar had just walked through hell to save the helpless children. From the edge of the crowd, Tom Reeves sat frozen on his horse, his plan turned to ash before his eyes. The letter he'd stolen weighed like lead in his pocket. For the first time, shame carved its mark into his face. As the barn collapsed behind them, the flames lighting the sky like dawn, Emma turned to the man in her arms. His skin was burned, his breath shallow, but his eyes, those gray eyes, were steady and full of something fierce and pure. "Why?" she whispered through tears. "Why would you risk everything?" He managed a weak smile. "Because they're all I have left," he said. Then, after a beat, "and because you came back for me." Around them, the murmurs began, soft, uncertain, but spreading fast. The town had seen. The truth, at last, was undeniable. And in that fiery night, as ash fell like snow and dawn broke over the ruins, Emma Carson and Luke Maddox's names were forever bound, not by scandal, but by courage, sacrifice, and a love born from the ashes of Carson Ridge. The morning after the fire rose soft and red over the blackened remains of Carson Ridge. Smoke still curled from the charred timbers, drifting into a sky the color of blood and gold. The barn was gone, nothing left but splintered beams and ashes that glowed faintly in the cool dawn light. Yet somehow, amid all that ruin, there was peace. Emma stood barefoot in the dirt, the hem of her dress singed, her face streaked with soot. But her eyes were steady now, filled not with fear, but quiet strength. Luke sat nearby, his arm bandaged, the twins asleep in a cradle salvaged from the wreckage. When she looked at him, something inside her shifted. It wasn't just relief, it was recognition. Two souls, both battered by life, had somehow found each other in the wreckage. Tom Reeves had been taken away in shackles before dawn. Sheriff Duggan had found the stolen letter in his coat, the proof of Luke's innocence. Word spread fast through town. By breakfast, even the gossiping tongues at the general store had fallen silent. The so-called deserter was no longer a criminal. He was a hero. When Luke tried to thank her, Emma only shook her head. "Don't," she whispered, handing him a hammer. "If you want to thank me, help me rebuild." And so they did. Under the red morning sky, they worked side by side, lifting boards, driving nails, and laughing when the hammer slipped or a stubborn plank refused to fit. The twins' laughter floated through the air like tiny bells, mixing with the smell of sawdust and fresh coffee. For the first time in years, Emma's smile came easy, wide, and unguarded. By the time the sun stood high, the skeleton of a new barn rose where the old one had fallen. It wasn't finished, but it was enough a promise that even after fire and betrayal, something beautiful could still take root. The townsfolk who passed along the road slowed their wagons to watch. Some tipped their hats, others called out words of apology or praise. And Emma, who once believed she could only trust herself, nodded in quiet forgiveness. She understood now that redemption wasn't something given. It was something earned, sometimes through fire, sometimes through love. As Luke wiped the sweat from his brow and looked over the land, his voice came soft, almost reverent. "Looks like we both got a second chance." Emma smiled, her eyes glinting with the sunrise. "Maybe it's what we were both riding toward all along." Weeks passed, and the ashes that once scarred Carson Ridge were now only a memory, pressed into the earth beneath new grass and the steady rhythm of life returning. The rebuilt barn stood proud beneath the wide blue sky, its timbers smelling of fresh pine and second chances. Cattle grazed contentedly in the pasture, the twins' laughter ringing through the air like wind chimes in the breeze. Luke sat on the porch as the day melted into amber light, one twin cradled in each arm. His voice was low, humming an old frontier lullaby that drifted out across the yard. Emma leaned against the doorway, her apron dusted with flour, watching him with a look she didn't yet have words for. There was something in the way his shoulders had softened, how the hard lines of sorrow round his eyes had eased when he looked up. The last rays of sunset caught in his hair. "They're safe now," he said quietly, glancing down at the babies. "Thanks to you." Emma shook her head, stepping closer until she stood beside him. "No, Luke," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of everything unspoken. "Thanks to us." For a long, still moment, neither spoke again. The prairie wind rustled the cottonwoods, and the world felt right, fragile, but whole. A family, forged in fire and faith, at last at peace beneath the endless western sky. As the firelight of the story fades, the wind across the prairie seems to whisper the same question that lingers in every heart. What would you have done if you were Emma Carson, alone on that storm-torn night? Would you have trusted the stranger sleeping in your barn with two helpless babies in his arms? Or would fear and gossip have guided your hand instead of compassion? Simities. The hardest thing in this world isn't surviving, it's believing in someone when everyone else turns away. Tell us in the comments below. Would your heart have seen the truth, even when the world whispered lies? Sometimes, the truest hearts are found in the most broken souls. Out on the frontier, where the wind carries both dust and rumor, it's easy to mistake a weary man for a guilty one or a quiet woman for a cold heart. But as Emma and Luke learned beneath the ashes of Carson Ridge, compassion has a way of revealing what judgment hides. It's the firelight in the dark, the hand extended instead of withdrawn. In a world where survival so often breeds suspicion, May we never forget that kindness can still light the way home. Never judge a man by the dust on his boots, nor a woman by the silence in her eyes, for every soul carries a story, and some are written in pain before they're spoken in love. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Tales of the Wild West for more stories of love, loss, and redemption beneath the endless frontier sky.